At this point, I think all of us have seen these screwdriver projectiles, and most of us are probably, understandably, skeptical still. Even if you see the data, it's easy to scratch your head and say, I'm not too sure what kind of black magic is going on here, but I don't trust it. So, for today's video, I was hoping to explain to you guys kind of the physics and understanding behind those fluted projectiles and show off some of the personal testing I did to see whether or not they really were doing what these manufacturers claim. I'm Boondock, welcome back, and let's get started. I think a lot of people are familiar with the term external hollow point when thinking of these projectiles. There are a few names on them depending who the manufacturer is. Technically, there's patented terms for different companies. I believe external hollow points is exclusive to G9. I know there's the FTM, which I think are like the honey badgers. Obviously Lehigh and Underwood. There's a couple of companies that make the same general concept. So I will largely be saying external hollow point. I am referring to that fluted type projectile as a whole though, and not a specific manufacturer. The point of the video is not to tell you which one of those is better amongst the groups, but rather than to just talk about how and if they do work as a whole and the concept compared to standard hollow points. So I think we gotta start with the physics to understand what's really going on with these. The base idea of these rounds is that they are capable of providing hollow point performance without relying on expansion. In theory, they should be more reliable. We have all seen hollow point testing. Sometimes you get beautiful pedaling, sometimes you don't. And hollow points as a general term tend to really struggle when you start to add barriers in, some even so with just basic clothing. So obviously it's a problem. We're talking typically self-defense rounds, and suddenly you take out the reliability of performance. A little questionable for defense at that point. Let's take our EHP round, right? As it hits a soft target, your soft tissues, in theory, these projectiles are able to liquefy or at least interact with the liquid in the system in its path, and as it moves along its path, the flutes along the exterior are going to help channel and direct where that liquid is going to be flowing. Since it's redirecting, it makes sense that it's going to help constrict and control that fluid flow in a way that's going to result in a pressure spike. So now we have those flutes that are controlling how the liquid is going to be moving, and then you add that on top of the rotational spin of a normal projectile, and that's going to result in that fluid being directed outward from that projectile's path. And because of that resulted concentrated flow of liquid, it's going to almost force the tissue to act like a saw and cut and tear the surrounding tissue, that the liquid tissue. I don't know how to word this. I'm saying tissue a lot. It's going to cause that liquid flow to interact with the surrounding tissue and almost cut and tear and saw through it. Which, if you're listening to me right now and you're scratching your head and you're saying, Jess, that still sounds like a shit ton of mumbo jumbo, I don't blame you. We can sit here and say all we want that, well, the projectile's taking liquid and moving the liquid, and sure, nonsense, still not sold. So let's break this down a little further. To those of you who might be more physics savvy, we're going to take some basic physics concepts, which are vetted out and proved concepts well understood within the physics world and a lot of applications outside of ballistics. If you believe them to be true to some level, which you physics people should, I would hope, then we're going to have to accept some validity in regards to applying those principles to the projectile as well. Two of the big names that I'm going to throw out here in terms of physics principles are going to be the Venturi effect and hydraulic jump. So starting off, I mentioned the Venturi effect, and to those of you who don't know, to those of you who know way more than me, please feel free to elaborate. This is going to be a very basic TLDR of this concept. So the Venturi effect is going to largely be associated with the idea that as that fluid is moved into a much more constricted and controlled area, it's going to cause the velocity of that fluid to actually increase along its path. The Venturi effect relating to the idea that as velocity increases in a fluid and its pressure is going to decrease as it flows through a constricted area. Hydraulic jump is a term that we usually associate with usually large bodies of water, like an open channel of water that's going to be in a state of high velocity. Usually refer to that as a state of supercritical flow. And we start to see hydraulic jump as that supercritical flow is abruptly transitioned into a subcritical flow state. Under normal circumstances, right, that abrupt transition is going to result in the water levels kind of rising, and it's going to create a very turbulent kind of window as it's making that height transition. You're going to see this stationary wave that's very turbulent, very disruptive as it's switching from supercritical to subcritical flow. That's going to dissipate a lot of energy. That resulting energy is going to result in kind of a shock wave, and that shock wave is really going to just tear and cut and eat at your tissue. If you guys have been here before, you know I always err on the side of caution when considering the effects of a temporary cavity. But if you believe this principle to be true and that the resulting impact on the surrounding tissue is cutting and tearing, rather than stretching like a standard projectile would, a standard hollow point would, then the effects of your temporary cavity are suddenly a lot less temporary. Suddenly that bounce back is going to be much more limited because instead of just stretching, it is cut and torn and weakened a lot more. So if we operate under the assumption that the projectile is moving fluid as it goes, then it makes sense that these standard fluid principles do also apply. And then it would stand to reason that the EHP type rounds are in fact capable of tearing a lot more as they move through the system than they would just stretch. This would lead one to believe that the EHP type rounds are going to cause just a little bit more at that point. And some of you are still scratching your head and saying, well, where's the fluid coming from? And I'm not quite sure. But if you think about the fact that we are largely made up of water, then it makes sense that as the projectile moves through and it creates that compression with tissue, muscle, skin, whatever, there is in fact just natural liquid within those areas. Your muscle does have a moisture content, a water content, a blood content, whatever. Liquid in some form is just naturally in those areas. Suddenly now we have a water source for the projectile as it moves through. It's just a natural part of the body. These rounds aren't necessarily just fabricating liquid out of nowhere. I do hear some manufacturers make the claim that the projectile in of itself is liquefying tissue. I can't confirm or deny if that is the case, but I can say that there is liquid in tissue regardless. So whether it fabricates the liquid in of itself by liquefying tissue, or it just uses the liquid that's already present, it does make sense that these rounds are able to use liquid in the system. Even for myself, I can sit here and understand why your average person might look at these rounds, hear all of that, and go, okay, it's snake oil. Cool. Where's the proof? I get it. So I took the liberty to get some rounds, make some gel blocks, and shoot them myself. So part of the reason I wanted to do 10% for this test instead of 20, like you guys probably expected from me, was that I think most pistol testing is done in 10 for what you guys might see online and compared to. So this makes this test a good baseline compared to everything else you might be looking at. But also, not only is YouTube gel terrible, YouTube gel test setups tend to be terrible. A lot of people like to smack just a piece of plywood directly in front of the block and call that a good barrier test. Not that that doesn't give you information, but if we're going to do the FBI barrier test setup, there is a difference in kind of how you're going to go about it. So FBI standards are going to dictate 10% gel block, the 30 seconds thick plywood, so about 3/4 of an inch, it's just a hair shy of that. And the end of the plywood board is going to be 18 inches from the start of your gel block, and the start of your gel block is going to be 10 feet from the end of your muzzle. I don't quite know where the 18 inches came from. I know the idea is that no one's directly against a barrier in most cases, right? You're going to have some semblance of distance between them. Obviously, there are times in which you're right up against it. I think the FBI says that 18 inches was their average distance from barrier to target. I have no clue how they came up with that number. It seems a little long to me. And then the next important thing to note is that once you go through barrier, the projectile is going to be impacted on its flight. So allowing that gap to be there lets you see how it's going to impact trajectory, yaw, all of these other factors that if your gel block were directly against the barrier, you're not going to be able to see. God damn it, I even cut t-shirts open. I'm sorry, I lied to all of you. There should have been a piece of loose t-shirt, just cheap cotton on top of the gel block as it went through to mimic clothing. Yay. Damn it. So, with that said, let's shoot some gel. I'm putting an execution hood on the block. Starting off with the HST block, we can see already that it went a nice chunk of the way through, but let's put a number to that. This round did hit about 13 inches of penetration. We can see that the neck starts off pretty immediately as well, and that the temporary cavity at its max is a little under 2 inches. It does look pretty well in terms of expansion right off the bat without opening it up, but those are just some base metrics here. I will say the Gen 1 HST rounds are a little worse for wear than the Gen 2, so if you do have an old box, be cognizant of that. The newer stuff is better in terms of performance. It is actually a really beautiful pedal. I'm actually really happy with how this one expanded. And I did try to pick a projectile with the closest one-to-one. This is gorgeous. I think we all know you don't regularly see pedals like this off of hollow point. But what I can say is that through multiple shots, I do know that this will do it every single time, whereas this is a coin toss. And that's not exactly what you want to see in a self-defense type scenario. All right, so this block here is the Honey Badger, and we can see after going through barrier that the Honey Badger hit pretty close to 15 inches of penetration. I'd say the round kind of flipped itself around around the 14-inch mark, 14, 15. The projectile doesn't expand. So we have the whole projectile left over on this pretty well intact from what I can see. Just like the HST rounds, this did initiate virtually immediately. And the temporary cavity at its largest point for the Honey Badgers is about 2.5, 3 inches. So the neat thing about the concept of these fluted type rounds, EHP type rounds, is that at the end of the day, going through barrier, they should be virtually indistinguishable in gel from a properly performing hollow point. And obviously this is just one shot into the block, but because they don't rely on that expansion, they're going to hit this performance 9.8 out of 10 times. Obviously things go wrong that can cause one of these rounds to be less than ideal. So I'm not going to say 10 out of 10 times, that would be a lie, but it's not going to be that 50-50 coin toss that you typically do see with hollow points. I'd love to show you the track line on this, and I still will, but I got overzealous and tore the gel apart, which meant I added in a lot of extra striations, and now this cavity is a little more difficult to look at. But you can see for this as well, looks like the initiation for the HST did start a touch sooner. This is the front of the block, obviously. We can see that the cavity for this did wind up getting a bit larger, and it did wind up sustaining that cavity for a larger chunk of time. So all the way down here, you can see that nice little spiral. It kept about 2.5 inches, whereas the HST round had a smaller cavity for a shorter chunk of time. And this projectile did go about 1.5 inches further through, which is always nice to see. The entire round is at the end here, but of course we will take it out to show. The round is here completely unscathed with the exception of rifling marks. We can already see off of the gel block that the performance was basically the same. A little bit further on this, a little bit, but a larger temporary cavity for all intents and purposes. Differences that could be shot to shot between these two blocks as it stands. I would argue you can get more oomph out of this with a thicker barrier, but because none of this mass was lost in the slightest, it's gonna do this every single time. So I decided to take shots into the largely still intact gel block that existed. This is bad science. The block is no longer the right volume, which means there might be some different play on how the round can travel through and impact. But did want to point out to you guys that the second round of HST that had gone through this block did exactly what you expect hollow points to do, especially with barrier. That thing went straight through, nice and clean shot. Came out the end with a very clean exit hole, by the way. Skipped the table and disappeared into the abyss. The point of these designs is that this is not capable of being clogged. I think we all know hollow points are able to be clogged in here, and then at that point they're basically very overpriced FMJ rounds. But because it doesn't have this cavity, you have no chance of this clogging on barrier. EHP, FTM, round, whatever you want to call it, those are virtually identical. Whereas the hollow point here, well, one of them's a bit less than ideal. Kind of just reiterating the fact that hollow points are a roll of the dice on your shots, whereas a FTM, EHP type styled round is gonna look like this time and time again. Even if all of that mumbo jumbo that I said in the beginning of this video is false, looking at the gel blocks themselves side by side, then worst case scenario, these rounds are still capable of providing hollow point performance at better than hollow point rates, right? And we can see here that the round, since it's not relying on expansion, is going to mimic that cavity, and if not better penetration, if not better cavity, but on like a hollow point, it's going to do it 100% of the time. Snake oil or not, you can't deny the fact that these rounds at their lowest possible level of performance and concept are going to be a more consistent hollow point, and more notably, a more consistent hollow point that's barrier blind. They're also not going to over penetrate like you typically see with standard hollow points. And if I was able to convince you off of the physics here, suddenly now it's not just a more consistent one-to-one, it's a more consistent and more lethal round. Unfortunately, using gel, we can only see the remnants of the gel block, and they look virtually identical. And I will say 95% of the time, the EHP type rounds and standard hollow point rounds that initiate properly will be virtually identical in regards to their gel response. And until I'm personally able to see myself in some capacity live tissue testing, I will still approach the idea of that fluid sawing mechanism with some skepticism. You can convince me on paper that it's true. You guys can shoot into Paul Harrell-esque meat targets and tell me what you think it looks like. But at the end of the day, even a hunk of pork shoulder that you're shooting into isn't going to respond like living tissue. So we're still not going to be able to see a direct result. Obviously, these companies use that as a selling point, and it does make sense on paper. I'm just not going to sit here and lie to you guys and say with 100% confidence that that is the case. But even without that, I will say I am a firm believer of those fluted projectiles in regards to consistent and good performance, on top of the fact that they're not hollow points. Or if you're in a shitty state like New Jersey or something, well, you can carry these. You can carry these and not have to worry about whether or not they will or won't expand on impact. So it's a lot more available to more consumers at that point. Either way you cut it, I do stand behind these projectiles, especially as a defense system. I do know that there are some projectile design differences between the brands that make these. So amongst the fluted projectiles available on the market, some of these might be a little bit better performing than others. I'm not going to sit here and tell you which one of those is the better round to purchase from that group, just kind of vetting out the concept here. I don't think I'm going to go ahead and call boondog bullshit on these. That's basically all I had for you guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye. Easy, don't look at this asshole.